So Michael talked about a little bit about how do you incentivize from a policy standpoint microgrids. Peter talked about how do you finance, how do you fund microgrids. John, I think, is going to talk about sort of the cybersecurity aspect of not just microgrids, but our macro grid. And I'm going to talk about how do you blow the grid up. You know, how do you come up with a technological breakthrough that will increase the resiliency of not just microgrids, but our larger, what I'll call our global grid. And it's important because we take electricity for granted on this planet. We take electrical power as the need for it is always being there. It's the lifeblood of our planet. It's what fuels innovation and further technological breakthrough, and we become highly dependent on that. Despite that, and you all in this room know this, that despite that fact, our increased dependence on electrical power, we're reliant on a grid that has a lot of vulnerabilities and a lot of limitations. In fact, you know, as we've increased our dependence on the grid, the vulnerabilities have increased and its reliability has gone down. We've got, most estimates say, about 5 million miles of grid in this country, about 200,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines. Most of those were built in the 1960s and 1970s. Most of them Thomas Edison would recognize because this technology hasn't changed a lot since the advent of the industrial age. Blackouts occur at a rate much greater than they did, say, 15 years ago. Weather events that used to cause about 20% of our power outages now are responsible for about 70%. We all remember the Fukushima power plant tragedy caused by the tsunamis. And it's not just weather, it's as Bill mentioned already, our grid is subject to physical attacks, cyber attacks. The Metcalf substation attack of a few years ago, where a single gun with a single weapon took out 17 transformers in 19 minutes. One estimate I read about said that there were 274 physical attacks against the grid over the last 3 years. And then in the cyber realm, one estimate is that we've got attacks against even our secure SCADA systems occurring at a rate of about once every 4 minutes. I thought Ted Koppel's book, Lights Out, was well researched and gives a rather dim projection of sort of the ramifications of a widespread cyber attack on our grid. But you know, the biggest threat to the grid doesn't come from these terrestrial sources, it comes from space. It's the geomagnetic disturbance that could come from a natural EMP event or a human-caused EMP attack. Most estimates say that you detonate a nuclear weapon 300 miles high over our country, you pretty much fry the electronics for our nation and take out big sections of our grid. So a pretty harsh sort of view of the vulnerabilities of our grid. And it's not just that, the grid has limitations. We know that we have to have power generation sources near the demand, right, because of the expense of transmission lines. And also it limits where we can put renewables. You know, we can't optimize the location of renewable energy sources because sometimes the windiest, the sunniest, the hydroelectric sources are far from population centers. Well, I'm not going to give you my definition of a microgrid because you've already heard at least two. But we all know that microgrids are one way to sort of diminish the threat that our macrogrid is facing. But the assumption has always been that the microgrids generation sources are distributed and organic to the grid itself, right? Those generators are located inside the fence lines. Well, what if there was a way to get power into that microgrid from an external source without reliance on the vulnerable transmission lines and the vulnerable external grid that I just talked about? Well, we think we have a way to do that now. And it's called a thing called the xenic surface wave. The xenic surface wave is a sort of physical phenomenon that is man-made, and I'll talk a little bit about how that happens, but it will allow you to carry power or a communication signal, for that matter, from any point on Earth to any other point on Earth at very high levels of efficiency. It's a wave that actually travels, it uses the surface of the Earth as a waveguide. And that's what enables the signal to travel very efficiently. So with this xenic surface wave, you can power a microgrid located anywhere from anywhere. For that matter, you can power your macrogrids the same way, bypassing the vulnerabilities of the wired grid. So the way it works is what we're calling Texzon wireless power, because it's our company that's developed the technology, uses what we're calling a transmitter probe to send the power wirelessly to a receiver. The transmitter probe notionally would be located adjacent to the generation source, wherever your power plant was. By the way, it's agnostic to the source of energy. Doesn't care if it's, renewable or fossil fuel based, whatever that source is, and it replaces that sort of long distance segment of the current transmission system. Receiver systems are positioned notionally at your microgrid location, or it could be located right at the substation where your long-distance transmission line would come in. Talk a little bit about this xenic surface wave and some of its physical characteristics. First off, the wave it doesn't age out, like a physical grid, obviously. It's also impervious to any kind of weather effects from lightning or rain or wind. As I've mentioned, EMP, one of the neat things about a xenic wave is it's impervious to electromagnetic pulse, whether it's a natural source or a man-made source. It does not affect this wave. Cyber attack can't get to it, at least in the wireless portion. You still got to protect your terminal points, both at the generation source and at your local grid. And another feature of this wave is at the right transmission frequencies, the surface of the Earth starts to look like a cue ball. It's almost like a copper-coated cue ball, so that the Earth will allow this signal to be transmitted very high levels of efficiency. In fact, at the right frequency, we believe the wave will propagate around the globe at about a 95% plus efficiency level in terms of power transmission. Think of it like a balloon that envelops the planet. You sort of blow up the balloon by injecting energy into the system using the xenic surface wave, and then wherever your receivers are located, those are like pinprick holes in the balloon. A load is established there, and the current flows directly to that point of load, just like you would with a wired connection. So I know some of you are thinking, well, if I'm walking around on the planet and this is going on, is it going to fry me? Well, as I'll talk about in a minute, this is not radiation. It's not a Hertzian radiated wave. Therefore, the RF fields are very low, well below the ANSI standards. We estimate less than 10% of the ANSI standard when the system is up and running, even with multiple transmitter probes and multiple receivers all around the planet. Obviously, we'll be doing a lot of testing to verify that as we get deeper into this deployment. Now, I know some of you are also thinking, well, this sounds like science fiction. This is decades away, right? You're just talking about theory. Well, fortunately, we're not talking about just theory. We're really on a fast track to commercializing this technology. The company's filed over 100 domestic and international patents, lots of experimentations and demonstrations at our Texas facility at various frequencies. We've been able to successfully transmit power at multiple ranges, and so far, all of our experimental data has matched the theoretical predictions right on the money. So we know that this is not just a random sort of science experiment. Data is measuring what our predictions say it will. We presented at an academic conference, an IEEE-sponsored conference at Baylor University back in March, and we also presented at the Society of American Military Engineers Conference in Phoenix in May, I believe. We've met with the FCC and the NTIA and have preliminary approval for some of the additional experimental testing that we have to do in various frequency ranges. And the design work is complete, and this is not what it looks like. I wish I could show you the real design for our global transmission tower, but the design work is complete on that tower, and we'll start erecting it in the next few months in Texas. This is our global demonstration project. That tower will operate at a frequency that it will allow us to send the wireless signal around the globe and do our first global power transmission test. So we're really excited about that. Okay, so some of you in the room are going, if this is so real, how come I haven't heard about it? And why didn't they invent it before, you know? Very interesting story about the historical evolution of this Zenik surface wave. Some of you are electrical engineers and may have heard of this guy, James Maxwell, the father of electromagnetic theory. His famous mathematical equation, Maxwell's equations, pretty much defined all electromagnetic theory. Well, Mr. Hertz took his theories and solved a continuum of equations that basically form the basis of Hertzian radiation, the frequency spectrum that we're familiar with today, everything from AM and FM to TV to microwave, you name it. When we're talking about radio or radiated energy, we're talking about what Hertz did. Well, interestingly, there was another sort of competing theory out there about electromagnetic wave propagation, developed by these two guys, Arnold Sommerfeld and Jonathan Zenik, because they also solved Maxwell's equations, and they found a very unique solution to those equations that led them to mathematically prove the existence of this surface wave. But they were never able to measure it. They got the math right, but they weren't able to observe or test it. So in the early years of the 20th century, we really had two competing theories of electromagnetic waves. Even Marconi, when he sent his first radio transmissions across the ocean, wasn't sure what was really operating here. He just knew it worked. All this came to a head in the 1930s. At a place called Seneca Lake, because the FCC was newly created and they knew that there were a lot of AM stations popping up and they had to regulate the frequency spectrum, and they had to figure out, is it Zenik waves or Hertzian radiations that's actually causing radiated energy. The long and short of these experiments in 1936 is they were able to successfully measure conventional Hertzian radiation, but were not able to demonstrate any kind of Zenik surface wave. Mr. Norton here, that's not pictured, from the FCC, went back and looked at Jonathan Zenik's math and discovered what he thought was a sign error in the math, and announced to the world that Zenik surface wave theory had been debunked, and that if you're an electrical engineer, you don't have to study it anymore because the math is wrong. And that was really the last that was ever heard of Zenik surface wave theory until our two scientists, Dr. Jim Coram and his brother Ken, came along, redid the math decades ago, found that the math was good, redid the experiment on Seneca Lake in 2014, and were able to launch and measure a Zenik wave. And they knew it was a Zenik wave because it was several orders of magnitude of higher field strength than what would be predicted by Hertzian radiation. So the Zenik surface wave was back at that point. We can talk a little bit more in the Q&A about sort of what those two scientists did and some of their other experimental work. But let me finish with just listing what I think some of the big implications for this Zenik surface wave technology. First off, we've been talking about resiliency a lot this afternoon. And you think about if you can eliminate that long distance high voltage transmission line, part of the segment of the transmission system, you remove a point of vulnerability, and one that now you can get after protecting your microgrids and your generation sources, and you've just increased your resiliency many, many fold. The next area is recovery times. Think about natural disasters and think about how long it takes to bring in new generation sources. What if you can fly in a portable receiver that can pick up via the Zenik surface wave an alternative generation source from somewhere else on the planet? You don't have to rebuild your local generator. You just tap into one that has excess capacity anywhere else on the planet. And now your ability to respond to a natural disaster or a conflict and bring power systems back online increases dramatically. From a resource standpoint, think about all the loss we experience today in our energy supply chains. Why is that? It's because we're often moving molecules, whether it's fossil fuels or whatever the energy source is, to a point where it can be turned into generated electrical power via pipelines, via transport tankers. What if you live in a world where you just build your generator at the source of the fuel? In other words, instead of moving molecules around, you move electrons around. You electrify the world by making the entire energy supply chain that much more efficient. And, revolutionary in the standpoint of the way this technology can help bring electrical power to the 17% of the world today that lacks access to reliable energy. That's 1.2 billion people. Some people ask me, is this a threat to the big power companies? I say, my goodness, no. This opens markets. This allows generators to be brought online, and you get the power directly to where it's needed by building out a local grid. So real capacity to accelerate development in the world. And finally, for those in this room that are struggling with ways to make renewable energy more economically viable, think about a world where you can put a Zenik transmitter right next to your renewable energy source, whether it's in the middle of the Saharan desert or the windiest place on the planet or a geothermal site in Iceland. I've now made renewables, the tyranny of distance that kills renewables today, suddenly even more viable than they already are. So the implications of this technology certainly go a long way. In closing, and we can get into it more in the Q&A, I just wanted to say one of the independent researchers that looked at our technology and verified the math and the experimental results said, I believe that Texzon wireless power will do for energy what the internet did for information, and we hope that's the case. Thank you very much.